today, I thought we'd talk about value contrast. Consider this an overview, meant to give people an idea of what the concept is. We will also talk about how it can be used and how we can practice using it. But before we talk about what value contrast is, we quickly have to take a look at this colored square. You could say that every color consists of three elements: hue, saturation, and value. Let's cast aside hue and saturation for now and only focus on value. Now, the value of a color is the same as the brightness of a color, so how light or dark that color is. For example, all of these squares have the same hue and saturation, but different values, which you can see in the black and white version below. And here, all the squares have different hues and saturation, so they look different, but despite that, they have the same value, so the same brightness, which, again, we can see if we make things black and white. So what is value contrast? I like to describe it as the difference between light and dark, meaning the difference between the light and dark values in your image. To understand this, let's look at an example. So here's a picture of a frog. First, we'll strip away all the color, and then look at what happens when we increase and decrease the contrast. As you can see on the picture on the left, the difference between the light and dark values has decreased, meaning the darks have become a bit lighter and the lights have become a bit darker. So all in all, the frog looks more gray, which is why it's a bit harder to see. On the picture on the right, the contrast between the light and dark values has increased instead, which is why it appears to be a bit sharper. Again, this is called value contrast. So how can we use value contrast? Well, one application is conveying distance between objects. In this picture right here, we're able to tell which trees are closer to us and which ones are further away, even without seeing the ground. This might seem obvious at first, but if we make the trees in the back the same value as the ones in the front, it's no longer as easy to tell which ones are closer to us. So the contrast or difference between these values is what conveys the distance between the trees. And of course, scale plays in here as well. Another application is mood. If you're making something moody and calm, you might want to use low contrast. As we saw earlier, low contrast can make things blur together and look a bit hazy, which can be useful for creating a calm and moody atmosphere. If you're making something with action and drama, you might want to turn the contrast up instead, because it tends to make objects look more eye-catching. Besides distance and mood, there is one use that is probably the most important one: definition. And to show you this one, I think the best way to do it is to jump into Photoshop. So say you have two colors. You have this gray tone, and you have this blue. Now, separated, they look fine, but if we take the blue and put it on top of the gray, we can see that they kind of blend together, like it's not as clear what's going on here. Especially at the border where they cross, you can tell the blue is on top, but it's not as clear. So let's change that. Let's make a copy of this, put it on the right, like so, and let's change the color of the blue one and see if that fixes our problem. So if we change the color, and there, something like that. So now it's yellow instead, and it's much more clear. You can clearly see what's going on here and where they overlap. So what actually happened there? Well, if we take a look at what we did in black and white, we'll see that while we changed the color of the blue dot, we also changed its value. So by changing the value of the color, we were able to achieve proper value contrast, which in turn created definition, making it easier to see what's going on in the image. Let's put this into context by looking at some art. Here's an illustration I made back in 2016. In the back, right over here, we have some clouds. Now, if you notice, you'll see that the shadow of the cloud kind of blends in with the sky in the back. By applying our black and white filter, we'll see why this is. The values of the cloud are actually quite similar to the ones in the sky. So just like in the previous example, when brought close to each other, they start to blend together. And when we then look at the illustration in color, we'll see that we've lost some definition in that area because there's not enough value contrast. And finally, really quick, how do we practice using value contrast? Well, one of the best ways to practice using this concept, or practice art at all, is to simply draw or paint in black and white. By doing this, the distraction of color disappears completely, and more focus can be put on achieving proper contrast. Another method of practice is to do thumbnail sketches. Thumbnail sketching is in and of itself quite a broad topic, but in essence, you make small sketches where you define light areas, dark areas, and midtones before you move on to a larger piece. And by making these miniature versions of the actual piece, you'll get a good sense of where to put which values, and that in turn will make things easier later on. It's also a good opportunity to just play around with lighting and see what works best. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope this was helpful. I obviously wasn't able to include everything about value contrast into this one video, because it is an overview after all, but I think I got the most important parts in there, and hopefully I was able to communicate that in an easy to understand way. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.